Hello and welcome to Teaching My Cat to Read, the various serious book review podcast. I'm Eli.
I'm Em.
And I'm Lottie, and this week we are discussing everything about Small Gods by Terry Pratchett.
I'm really excited to talk about this book.
I'm so
love
excited to talk
Discworld.
about this book.
I love Terry Pratchett, and this is probably my favourite standalone book out of the whole Discworld series. So I've read it before.
I'm always surprised that it's not first on people's lists when people always ask the question, where should you start with Discworld? And honestly, I think it is the one that you need to know the least about the world for.
Maybe. So, I mean, Lottie can give us a good insight on that because Lottie hasn't read any Discworld yet before this.
Yes, I'm really excited. I was saying to Eli, this is the first time I think I've, been around for somebody's very first Discworld experience. Everybody else I know who's read it has, read it for years and, so this is a brand new, exciting... Yeah.
I mean, this is a consequence of just having reread Wheel of Time on loop perpetually for about 15 years.
That takes up all of your bandwidth. There's no room left for other books.
Basically, it just takes up all of my bandwidth. But I loved this book. I absolutely loved this book. I mean, I think I agree with Eli and Em that if you haven't read Discworld, it is such a good introduction to his style of writing, the whole world, which how did I not pick up it's a Discworld because it is a disc? I just didn't pick that up at all. When I heard about it, sort of on the edges of my sort of peripheral reading knowledge. But I don't know. What would your guys' terrible summary be? Because mine would be, I've heard it's God is not a turtle, for he was a tortoise, and an angry one because he hadn't had any melon.
I think where is your god now? Oh, he's in the dung heap because an eagle dropped him there.
Yeah, hiding in the lettuce patch, yelling about eagles. Yeah, that's basically mine. The other alternative I had was Mad Max Fury Road Discworld edition.
I mean, that is also
They
true.
disappear into the desert, and then they try and find a... Yeah, no, I'm going to yell about that later in detail. But
So for, I guess, people who haven't read Discworld and haven't read this book before, I mean, my sort of I guess, summary would be, it is... Om is a small god. He hasn't got many followers. He's only got one, and the guy who is his sole follower isn't very high up in the Church of Onium, and therefore he has to be persuaded to try and go and become the prophet and get some more followers.
So one thing to note about this is, it's the Church of Om is the name of the god, and so it's Omnianism, which is Terry Pratchett making a pun on Catholicism, because Catholicism comes from Church Latin Catholicus, which means universal or general, which is obviously the same as omnis.
How did I not notice that before?
I think I had to have it pointed out to me, but that's where he got that name, and then you also have the great god Om, which is kind of sort of a humorous in terms of just as an onomatopoeic Om.
Yeah.
It's such a good description.
The premise is that gods in the Discworld have this reciprocal relationship with their followers where they are fed by belief, and the more true believers they have, the stronger they are. And what you've got is this situation where there's this great Omnian church and this great structure, and they've got the Inquisition, the Quisition, who's torturing people who don't agree with them. And all of these people who are on the surface very devout and very dedicated to the Church of Om. But in all of that, there's only one guy who actually believes in Om, the concept of the god.
Yeah.
And so this god, who has this massive church, which is a huge political power, is only powerful enough to take the shape of a tortoise.
A one-eyed tortoise.
A one-eyed tortoise at that,
Yes.
yeah. And it's about him trying to regain his former glory and understanding what that means, and being solely dependent on this one guy, whose name is Brother, who is not only the only believer he has, but seemingly the only decent dude in the entire place.
Hey, now, I don't think that's fair.
No.
I think that's in some ways, that's almost the premise. I think that, one of the things they say about... So the main antagonist is called Varbis. He works for the Quisition.
He's the head of the Quisition.
And one of the things he says is that there are no excesses of the worst psychopath that cannot be recreated by a decent family man who comes into work every day and does his job, and just does his job.
Yeah.
And if you know that, you know everything you need to know about people. And which is horrifying.
Well, it's very relevant to the state of the world over the last, I mean, really as long as we've been alive, but sort of recently it's thinking about people who will commit atrocities and the fact that they're also still human beings, and the fact that structures like this can take on a life of their own and leave the thing that started them, which may have been good or, you know, at least honest, like belief in Om, behind. Yeah.
I tell you what I did like, just about the whole structure, was when he's talking to Om to try to prove who Om is, and he's like, oh, I think that this great god will come down in the shape of an eagle or a boar or a bull, like something that is quote unquote powerful, and yet he's like, no, I'm just a tortoise. Please believe in me, because you're my sole believer.
I mean, to be fair, he tries to keep that from Brother as long as possible. Like, he is absolutely convinced that, like, so that the very start of the book, which I adore, is Brother is working in the garden of the Citadel when a tortoise, mother hugger, a tortoise, I can use words, falls out of the sky, basically, because so it starts with a fun fact about eagles, which is that they're the only thing in the world that has worked out how to eat tortoise. And what an eagle does is it picks up a tortoise and then flies very high and then drops it on a hard thing. This will be important later. But yeah, basically this eagle has dropped this tortoise and it's somehow managed to drop it in the only soft landing spot in the entire Citadel, which just happens to be behind Brother.
It's the compost heap for his melon garden.
Yeah, and the other thing I liked about that was that, like, Om doesn't remember that he's a god until, like, halfway through the fall, either. Like, his power is so diminished that until he's within, like, 10 feet of his believer, he's forgotten that he's a god.
Yeah. It reminded me of the falling whale from Hitchhiker's Guide. That it just was like, oh, I'm a whale.
Yeah.
What is that shape coming up towards me? Maybe it wants to be friends with me. Splat. I've forgotten where I was going with explaining that.
Well, I was thinking about Om being a tortoise. It's one of the narrative themes that runs through the entire Discworld is this idea of morphogenic, sort of, I forget what the second word is. Almost determinism,
isn't it?
Yeah, morphogenic determinism.
Function.
Yeah, so Om being a tortoise means that his thoughts are tortoise-shaped, and he starts thinking about implementing rules like there shall always be an abundance of melons and you shall always be kind to tortoises, which he'd never have had.
Make steps shorter.
Make steps shorter.
Steps should be less high, please.
And it's a nice way of showing how perspective will change your priorities.
Yeah.
And how he becomes a better god for having been in lower circumstances.
Yeah.
It makes him a more compassionate and sort of likable entity.
He's an asshole, but yeah.
Oh yeah.
At least to start with. But yeah.
He becomes one who's willing to listen to people, and he's become one who's been in other people's power before, because he's completely dependent on Brother for almost all of this book.
Yeah, yeah. I was going to say, actually, that's the thing I wanted to talk about in terms of perspective, because I said that the eagles having figured out how to eat tortoises thing is actually, like, thematically weirdly important. There's a whole thing about how, like, the tortoise, before it's dropped, probably thinks, oh, what a great friend I have in the eagle. He's showing me this, like, vast world that I didn't know, you know, my perspective was, like, 2 feet above the ground before.
He's taken me on a great adventure. How kind.
Yeah. He's shown me the world. It's all opened up before me. I have all this new knowledge and understanding and perspective. And then the eagle drops him. Mm-hmm. And, like, the parallels are drawn throughout the book between the relationship between the eagle and the tortoise and a god and a prophet.
Oh, I didn't pick up on that.
In that God, they pick their chosen one, you know, and they give them all this, well, how much insight they actually give them is sort of an open
dubious
question at this point. But, you know, they give them this perspective, and this, by walking with God, it changes your perspective on the world, it changes your perspective on religion, all of this. It's this brand new vista of understanding of your place in the universe opening up before you. And then they'll just let you die. You're just food for them. They don't care. And it's interesting that you mentioned reciprocity, Eli, because I think that's kind of, it's not reciprocal to start with. That's sort of the problem, is that all the gods are eagles looking at tortoises going, good eating on one of those.
Yeah.
Instead of, these are people in which I am, like, that I have a symbiotic relationship with, that I owe them something.
Well, you talking about gods choosing prophets and then sort of spitting them out again makes me think of Moses not being able to enter Canaan in the Old Testament. He lives his whole life in service of God and leads people through the desert and so on, and then his people get to the land of milk and honey, and he's not allowed to enter because of like one sin he did once. And that's I think it raises a really interesting question about how can a god have any kind of ethically, like any kind of balanced relationship with someone who's not a god, because by dint of being a god it puts you in an entirely different category, right? Which is why Om's dependence on brother throughout this is really interesting.
I really enjoyed, I mean, I don't have any sort of background in Catholicism or anything like that. I just really enjoyed when brother was talking to and just explaining what all these rituals were in the was it Citadel town?
The Citadel,
in the Citadel,
yeah.
And just saying, oh yes, because you said this thing to this prophet, and he's like, did I? I don't remember saying that. And it's sort of this different perspective, like we were saying, on, On might have said something as a throwaway sentence, and people have sort of taken this and taken it to become something completely different to what he meant at the start.
Or even like not something that he said at all. Like there's a really hilarious passage where like brother is trying to like explain why they do something in the Citadel. I can't remember what, and he's like, you spoke to this prophet, he was 8 feet tall, horns, fire, blah, 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 blah. You appeared to him in a pillar of fire. And Om's like, rings a bell. And he's like, so you said this when you were a pillar of fire? And Om's like, I don't think I did. And brother's like, well, what did you say? And Om's like, as far as I remember, it was, hey, see what I can do. And then there's an awkward silence. And I love that so much. But yeah, it's like, it's a really interesting, like, the difference between what Tortoise thinks is appropriate, because we get hints of what it was like in the bad old days when he was first like growing out of small goddom. And I think he talks about the martyrdom of his first believer at one point. And there's all this kind of like, sacrifices are great, that's what humans are for, blah 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 blah. And then as a tortoise he finds out about the Quisition. And that was the thing I wanted to talk about, actually. So people talk about Pratchett being a humorist. He's a humorous writer a lot. He's satirizing fantasy, and he is an incredible comedic writer, don't get me wrong. But one of the things I really liked about this book was how well balanced the violence was with the humor. Like, it was like every other paragraph, it's alternating between like, that's hilarious and that is the darkest in one sentence. Yeah, the dark side of this perversion of the religion. Yeah, like there's a really sinister use of a place for everyone and everyone in their place, referring to the Quisition, and it just like shivers down my spine. But it was a really interesting way of portraying violence, I think, because we very rarely see it in this book. It's never described explicitly. We just see other people reacting to it, and particularly Om reacting to it. And if he wasn't a tortoise, he definitely would have thrown up,
Yeah. I would like to relate that to how Varbis is always described as being, it's not passionate what he does. He does not kill or order the killings and torturings and violence against people because of anger or because of sort of, he does it because
he doesn't get a kick out of it.
Yeah, he doesn't get a kick out of it. He does it because he wants to see what's going to happen, or he thinks it's going to further his career, essentially. As, he's aiming to become the next head of the church, essentially. But it's not brutal, exactly. It is dispassionate.
It's really uncomfortable.
He's not cruel, exactly.
So Varbis and Brutha go to Ephebi to try and, I guess, convert the Ephebians.
Yeah, or have an excuse to go to war with them.
Basically have an excuse to go to war. And they're on this boat, and there's some porpoises that turn up, and Varbis says, oh, there's some lunch. And the sailor's like, oh no, because we believe that the spirits of all sailors come as porpoises. He's like, oh no, you can't believe that. That's not in the church.
You're good Omnians, aren't you?
You're good Omnians. And then he gets them to fetch a harpoon, and so they're saying, oh no, you can't do it.
No, what they say is, you can't do that. And he says, no, I won't.
You will.
And he hands the harpoon to the captain.
Yeah. And then it cuts off.
And that's an interesting, like, there's a repeated motif of the thing about Varbis is that he makes other people like him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He makes you complicit.
He reproduces in other people's minds. Like, just by his presence, he makes other people into smaller versions of himself.
It's a corrupting influence where he is... Yeah, he is making you complicit in the violence.
Yeah. And one of the things I really like is the contrast between... So when we're sort of following Varbis around, it's all very... Like we were saying, it's cold, it's dispassionate, it's quite sharp and incisive and clear-cut what's going on in his head and what he's doing and the description of him. It's quite... Not laid back exactly, but there's no, like, strong emotion with it. It's just cold.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then we see... I think after... So, Brother thinks he's having a vision when a tortoise starts talking to him. Understandably, he gets a bit upset. And as a result, Varbis ends up visiting the vegetable garden and sees a tortoise. And unlike everybody else in the book who sees the tortoise and basically goes, there's good eating on one of those, which gets very sick of by the end.
Yeah.
Varbis goes, and turns the tortoise on its back.
In the sun.
And thinks, maybe I'll come back in a couple of hours and see. And he wedges it. He doesn't just turn him upside down. He wedges him so he can't roll back onto his front and leaves him in the sun.
Yeah, he puts, like, stones underneath each side so that he's trapped there. He does it just to see what will happen.
Yeah. And it's this really... And, like, the next time sees Varbis, he loses his...
Yeah.
Like, he's just telling Brother, like, push him over the side, push him over the side. He's get rid of that man right now, this instant.
Like, he is such a obscene threat that he's just...
Yeah, he has such a visceral reaction to him.
I want to actually... Thinking about the whole making people complicit in his violence and his atrocities. There's a short story by Ursula K called Those Who Walk Away from Omelas.
Yeah.
And the premise is there's this wonderful society where everything is fantastic and beautiful and deep and meaningful and there's no pain and suffering except for one small child who is locked in a basement and can never be shown kindness and whose existence is wretched. And the suffering of that child is what allows the city to be as good as it is. And how do the people of the city come to terms with this? And the ones who don't are the ones who walk away from Omelas. And that as a sort of, all of these people in the Citadel probably know on some level what the Quisition does. I mean, some of it's made public.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, they definitely know.
Yeah.
They just don't let themselves think about
Well,
it.
I'm not sure that... Well, I suppose Brother does, actually, doesn't he? He knows that bad things happen. And it's...
He thinks it's right. He explains it to on numerous occasions.
Yeah, that's true.
He's
Yeah.
here is the mechanism by which we burn people alive.
Yeah, and it's just, they've all made their peace with that. And that's an example of Terry Pratchett being an excellent observer of people, because that is what most people do. Even in this short story written by Ursula K, who is, I think, very optimistic about the morality of the human species. The ones who walk away are still a tiny minority.
Yeah.
I definitely think, like, Varbis, he has sort of this weird moral compass. He can justify doing these awful things because he himself isn't executing what is going on. He's just suggesting it, but because he suggests it and he has the power of the Quisition behind him and people are scared of that, thereby they'll just do whatever he says.
Well, there is also the aspect that people do actually sort of, they have accepted the, like, well, if Varbis says it so, it must be so, because he's much more learned and pious.
And that's his own internal logic as well.
Yep.
If he is suspicious, he believes that... Well, does he?
Yeah.
It's kind of unclear, but, like...
It does, and it also doesn't matter.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because there's two kind of contradictory things there. On the one hand, he is very much like, we would not be suspicious of these people if the great god Om had not put suspicion in my place. So suspicion is the same as proof. Which is how the Quisition kind of justifies itself, is sort of the smallest whisper of discontent or suspicion is enough to get you in front of the Quisition, because where does that stuff come from if not from Om? And I would kind of classify that as a belief, except that one of the repeated themes is that, like, what you take with you into the desert is just you and what you believe. And Om says it on multiple occasions. Nothing's going in, nothing's going out. In Varbis, he's got a mind like a steel ball, and he doesn't believe in anything.
Yeah.
I was going to get you guys, can you explain that a bit more? Because like I say, haven't read any of the Discworld books, and I knew Death is a character, and I really enjoyed Death. Yeah. Death turns up, all of his texts in like of different font and small capitals, and just going, oh, hi, are you Death? Yep. Where are we going? Dunno. Off you go. But
yeah,
it obviously hinted at something more, but can you guys explain like the desert and what that sort of means in the wider context? Is that a thing, or is it just...
I think it is what you see in the book. It's this idea that,
basically, yeah,
at the end of the day, how do you think you lived?
So yeah, it's a continuing thing in Pratchett that what happens when you die is what you believe happens when you die. Like, that is something that turns up a lot. But also there is, on frequent occasions when we see characters die, quite frequently there is a desert of black sand that they have to cross. That is also a repeated motif. And in this, it's very much tied to the physical desert and the idea that, what is in the desert is only what you believe. That's all you get to take with you. So basically, like, a lot of the Discworld runs on belief. Magic and belief. If you believe it can happen, if it's magical, if it makes sense magically for a thing to happen, it happens. Yeah, I don't know. Eli, do you want to jump in here? I'm kind of...
I was thinking about...
It's hard to explain if you haven't read a lot of them, because you just sort of pick it up out of the ether. It's just sort of imbued in the logic of the world that, like... belief makes reality.
Yeah, it's sort of... So death is there to handle the moment when somebody stops being alive and make sure that they sort of continue to exist, sort of.
Right, yeah.
But what happens after that is not... It's not the domain of death. It's something else. And we don't really ever...
It's not really...
So it's kind of like the Ninth Gate.
Yeah, it sort of doesn't form part of the stories, really. It's just, each individual person has something after that, but what it is kind of dependent on them. And that's the desert. Yeah. It's just you and what you believe.
I definitely think I'd like to reread these books again once I've read some more Pratchett books to pick up those little... Because they're definitely things that I'm thinking... The gardener who doesn't talk.
Oh, he's a recurring character.
Yeah. He's in a lot of other books.
I'm pretty sure. Yeah. I remember you guys had mentioned it to me. Like, there's this like the history monks.
Yes.
And I was thinking, this must be this person, but I don't know who he is or what he does. And I'm like, I want to find out more. So in that sense, if you haven't read any Discworld books...
I think that's actually his first appearance.
Yes,
is it?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, there aren't any... The history monks come into it... I think they're in Night Watch and they're in Thief of Time.
Yeah, because Thief of Time is the book directly before Night Watch.
Yeah, because Night Watch...
It sets up Night Watch.
So Night Watch is the time travel Les Mis Discworld fic.
And Thief of Time is what narratively allows that to happen.
Yeah, basically. Time breaks, and then Vimes falls through the cracks and reenacts Les Mis, but as Javert, sort of, but better.
Yes,
nice
good Javert.
Good Javert.
Javert with a moral compass.
Yeah.
Instead of just the law.
Yeah. Well, no, he is like good. The law is, Yeah, I don't know if we want to talk about sort of the wider Discworld canon, sort of. So, because I'm hoping we will do other Discworld books on this podcast.
Please, can we? I want to read some.
Yeah,
exactly. So, I mean, there are various approaches to getting into this whole series, because there's 40-something books now.
Yeah.
And obviously Terry Pratchett died a couple of years ago, and therefore the series is not going to get any bigger, at least not by his hand. But it's a lot to get into, even though they're quite quick to read. And there's various series that run through them. So there's like sets of books that deal with the same recurring characters, like the men who formed the City Watch, or I say the people who formed the City Watch, because later on it grows to encompass a lot more than just human men, and this trio of witches as well, and the academics who live in the definitely not Oxbridge University in the main city, and
they have a senior wrangler. I think they definitely they are Oxbridge, yeah,
and books following Death. And there's
Death and Death's granddaughter Susan,
who's amazing. She's the best.
I think she's a good place to start. Like, I feel like
people do recommend the Death books as an entry point into Discworld.
Yeah,
it's interesting because, like, when I first started reading them, I definitely would have said either you start with Guards or you start with Mort. And the thing about Mort is you kind of need to read it for all the Susan books to make sense. But I think it's not it's not as good as the later Death books.
Sure.
Right.
But I think God's Guards is not as good as the later Watch books.
You know, I think Soul Music and Hogfather are like up there.
Yeah.
In Discworld canon. And I feel the same about The Witches. Like, Equal Rights is just not a very good book.
Yeah.
I don't think. But like when you get to like Carpe Jugulum and
Carpe Jugulum is very
Lords and
good.
Ladies and stuff, the Witches books are just off the
You
charts.
kind of have
amazing.
to read them to appreciate what's going on in the later books.
Yeah.
Even though they're not
I mean, I
great.
usually say start with Guards. That's usually
Guards
my...
is, I think, the best of all the series that there are within Discworld. Of all of their first books, Guards is the one that suffers the least from Terry Pratchett having not quite solidified what he wanted yet.
Right.
Yeah.
I think a lot of
definitely.
the series, their first books is him trying something out and then getting into his stride later. But you still need to read the first one to have the others make sense.
Like there's 2 Rincewind books before Sorcery that just aren't.
No,
I mean, I do think Light Fantastic is leaps ahead of Colour of Magic, but like
I read the series in chronological
Sorcery
order.
is a really good book.
Yeah.
Sorcery is the first Rincewind book that is a genuinely good book, in my opinion.
I feel when we have the blog post that goes out with this episode, we should probably make a list of the order of how we recommend you should read.
There are so
books.
many guides out there already.
Or we can link some guides, so if you're a
Exactly.
newbie like me, you can join along the readathon.
I love Discworld so much. A mutual friend of ours is sort of one of the people who really, really inspired me to read Discworld, and they said that like a lot of their personal philosophy, having read it as a teenager, is informed by Terry Pratchett's outlook and his humanism and his humour.
That's definitely true of me as well. It's one of the most influential works of literature that I've read in terms of like teaching me to just think about.
Yeah.
Like a recurring theme in Terry Pratchett is like no one has the right to be stupid.
Yeah.
You don't have the right to say I didn't know, I didn't think about it. You know, you have to think, you have to question, you have to say why should I do this thing? What is it for? Why have we always done things this way?
I'll tell you what, one thing I definitely enjoyed was there was a few references that I highlighted that show the thought process in his writing and the forethought. So one was the existence of a badly put together watch proved the existence of a blind watchmaker. And I'm thinking
So good.
that's the watchmaker argument that I remember learning about in GCSE RE. That the proof for God is purely, well, if a watch is perfect, then therefore, you know, there must be a maker, and therefore that would be God.
Well, it's like looking at the human spine and going intelligent design, my arse.
That's one of the things I love about being Jewish, because you can be like, God, do you take constructive criticism? Thinking about also like things that run through Terry Pratchett's books, and this is something we'll talk about when we read one of the other books in which this is a more major theme, but the idea of sin as looking at people as things. All sin comes down to, all evil comes down to when you start thinking of people as things and not people. And I was just thinking about that in relation to and his perception of his followers.
Yeah.
Because he doesn't think of them as people anymore. He's thinking of them as things, as means to an end, as
They're
fuel.
cows. They produce the stuff that he eats.
Or sheep.
Yeah,
They're sheep.
That's it.
And
Yes.
so and
There was an interesting joke about the sheep and the goats thing where he's like, you know, Om's first believer was a shepherd, and Omnianism would have been a very different religion if it had been a goat
would have been
herd,
Judaism.
because sheep need to be driven and goats you have to lead.
Oh, I did not pick up on that at all.
yeah, goats
Yeah.
need to be persuaded.
Oh my god.
Goats are stubborn little
Yes, basically. I mean, thinking about the whole idea of like gods having to go and search for believers in order to have power, and basically make a deal with the believer that these are mine, these are my people, and they're going to give me power, and that's literally like the origins. That's in the law. That's the origins of Judaism. Is God went to all the different peoples and said, "Hey, I've got a contract. Do you want to sign with me?" And all the people were like, "No," and the Israelites were like, "Hey, can we look at that actually?" And God was like, "Sure," and they were like, "Sure, but we've got some corrections we want to make."
They turned it back covered in red ink, like, hey, we have some thoughts.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the start of Judaism. That's the covenant. So I really like this as a fantasy representation of religion and faith and ethics, because it very much fits with my personal worldview about, it matters what you do, and it matters what you do in the dark, in the sense that there's this one line where somebody says, well, it doesn't matter if we fight people that we don't have to fight. Or I can't remember the exact context, but it's somebody saying, well, what does it matter if we do this, if we don't do this thing?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that moment. So basically, in the long arc of the plot, they go away from the Citadel to Ephebe because Varbis wants to start a religious war, essentially. And they come back. They almost don't make it. Brother carries Varbis through the desert.
With the lion.
And then basically, and stands up to him basically at the end. He's like, I know what you did.
Yeah.
I can't make anybody else believe it, but I know. And Varbis like straps him to the back of an iron turtle and is like, well, I guess we'll cook you to death now. And some of the friends that Brother has made along the way turn up at this moment. And one of them, who grew up in Ephebe, is like, we have to do something. We have to go and we have to try and get Brother off that turtle. We've got to fix this. And the guy that grew up in the Citadel, who all this time has been like trying to overthrow Varbis and trying to get to Ephebe so they can bring back this philosopher that can prove the earth is flat.
But he wants like a glorious revolution. He wants...
Yeah, essentially. And yeah, the Ephebian guy, the philosopher, is like, we've got to fix this. And the guy that grew up in the Citadel is like, oh, no, think about it. Like, think about it. Be reasonable about this for a second.
Yeah.
We can't do it. There's hundreds of them, and there's only like 10 of us. We can't save Brother. We just can't. And if he dies on that turtle, he's a martyr for our cause.
Yeah.
If he dies, we stand a real chance of fixing this. And the Ephebian's just like, what the is wrong with you? And he's like, why, what does it matter? If we go in there and we all die, like, what would that do?
What would that matter?
Yeah, what would that change? And the Ephebian guy just goes, you mean you don't know?
Yeah, it matters.
And that moment has always really stuck with me.
Yeah, there's this trope on TV tropes of like what you are in the dark, and it very nicely echoes where Brother is or has just been at this point in the book, where he could have left Varbis in the desert to die. Nobody would have known except Om, who is in favour of him leaving Varbis in the desert to die. But Brother says, no, that's not who I am. That's not who I want to be.
Yeah.
And so he picks him up and almost dies trying to save Varbis.
Yeah. I gotta say, actually, this is a thing that reminds me a little bit of when we were talking about Anansi Boys, and we were saying that the thing that makes Fat Charlie a protagonist is that he just keeps doing things, one after the other. And that's very much like Brother's thought process.
Yeah.
Is kind of every decision he makes in the thing. He doesn't have a long-term plan. He never has a long-term plan. He only knows what he can do next.
Yeah.
That is the right thing by his own lights to do. He can save the library. He can carry Varbis across the desert. He can not slap him when Varbis very pointedly offers him a cheek.
Yeah.
You know? Which is another really powerful moment that just, blew my mind. But Brother and Fat Charlie have a lot in common in that sense, I think, is that their strengths as protagonists are just keeping going.
Just trying to do the right thing every time.
I make the choice that's in front of me and I do it. And sometimes that goes wrong. Brother, for example, does... Basically, the Omnians have lost the war with Ephebe, and what they're technically there to do is sign a peace treaty. And they are essentially kept in a palace that is surrounded by this, booby-trapped labyrinth, right? And that's the reason that they can't just bring an army in and capture the tyrant and take over the whole city. And the thing is about Brother is that he has perfect recall. So he knows the safe way through the labyrinth. And at one point, he actually leads Varbis through it.
Sort of at knife point, but at
Sort of threatened.
the fear of what the Quisition could do to him point.
I don't know. See, that is not actually how I read it.
That's true, actually. He isn't afraid of the Quisition.
I think he's doing the right thing.
He isn't afraid of the Quisition. There's a moment earlier where they describe beating Brother as like beating a mattress. Like, we think he only shows pain to show willing.
Yeah.
Like, it just doesn't really figure in his worldview at all. But what he is worried about is Varbis dying, actually. The reason that he does it is not... It's not that he's scared of what's going to happen to him. It's that if he doesn't do it, Varbis is going to try the labyrinth on his own and he's going to die. But then you can see him rejigging that, because the further they get through, the more people Varbis kills. Again, off screen, largely.
There's one killing that's basically on screen where it's somebody who's tending the labyrinth, essentially, is like a guard. And Brother is just absolutely horrified. And the narrative later talks about him being just absolutely full of blinding rage towards Varbis.
Yeah, I think that kind of sort of, I say shatters his worldview, but it
changes.
It changes his point of view in that moment when he sees that. And as a reader, I think one of the other things I really enjoyed with Pratchett's writing style is is like many other authors I've read, it takes you along with the journey. And so sometimes in fantasy, when I've read some fantasy books and you stop reading them, half the time it's because the author's got this incredibly complicated world, but there's no character for you to go along with to have this world shown to you.
Audience avatar.
Yeah.
And I think what's so nice about this book is you are taken, as a new reader, never read any Discworld novels, but I understood the mechanics of the fantasy world. And I think that just highlights just how good a writer he is. It's a short book, but it is impactful. It doesn't have to be like a big tome like I normally read in my fantasy books.
Yeah.
But it is still impactful.
The story world is deep.
Yeah.
And we're introduced to it. I think I like the way we follow Brother. Because the thing is, Brother doesn't really know... Brother is not experienced in the world. You know, he's lived in the Citadel most of his life. And he believes, at the start of the book, he not only is Om's only true believer, but he also genuinely believes in the structure. He believes in the Quisition, he believes in the High Priests, he believes in Varbis.
And the fact that they're wise, the fact that they deserve to be there.
Yeah, he believes in the whole thing.
Or the idea that they deserve to be there.
Yeah, exactly. That was actually, this is what I want to get into my Mad Max theory here a little bit, because I wanted to talk about the, how little time it takes for Brother to walk in the company of his God, for him to genuinely change his mind and start questioning and go, this is all f***ed up, actually.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't take very long at all.
Yes.
Like, he doesn't take him very long to believe that Om is who he says he is, even if he's protesting it for quite a while, because Om wouldn't be a tortoise.
Yeah.
But, like, it doesn't take him very long to believe what Om is saying, and it doesn't take him very long for him to react almost like Om isn't really trying. Om's goal in this story is not to get Brother to be a good person. It's to, like, use Brother to make sure he gets more believers, right? He's not really interested in whether Brother takes down the Quisition or dismantles the horrible power structures of the Citadel.
He wants Brother to survive, but that's pretty much it. Yeah.
He just wants this one follower.
But just by walking in Om's company, just by having that perspective for a bit, like, not very long at all, he comes to question this entire edifice of belief. And on the other hand, we have Simony, who has been brought up in the Citadel and has not, like, it's not changed the way he's thought at all. Thinking that the Citadel is wrong does not change, like, the mechanisms he wants to use to fix it, you know? He thinks like a member of the Citadel, even when he's trying to take the Citadel down.
And it's this whole thing that Pratchett has of, like, the Master's tools cannot dismantle the Master's house.
Yeah, essentially. And it reminded me very much of Nux from Mad Max Fury Road, where, like, you know, he's out of his horrible warlord culture for, like, 2 days with people who treat him like people. And who, like, he's not a priority for them either. Like, he is literally along for the ride.
He's a nuisance.
They keep him alive because they're not horrible people.
Yeah.
And, like, they're just getting on with their own shit. But he's in their company for, like, a couple of days before all that toxic programming just falls away.
Yeah.
And it feels very similar for Brother. And yeah, I don't think we really get so much in Mad Max that contrasting figure of Simony. We don't get that. We don't get to see the minds of the people following. Like, there isn't any equivalent where, like, one of the people that's chasing them goes, actually, you know, I'm trying to take down the Citadel from the inside because I want to be the next Immortan Joe or whatever.
Yeah.
We don't have that equivalent. But, like, I think it's really interesting, the contrast between how quickly Brother can change his mind, how quickly Brother learns, and all the other people that we see who know that the Citadel is wrong.
But they can't see any alternative. The most different thing they can imagine is still something that looks very similar.
Yeah. And I mean, even Frit, like, I love, like, there's a general who dies very early on because he's fought the Omnian Wars all his life, and, like, Varbis is talking about starting another one, and through this really sort of base trickery, and he's like, actually, you know what, I can't stand this. What's to stop me from just killing Varbis? And he doesn't make it, he does die, but, like, he is maybe one of the only other people that, like, he can't see a way past it. He picks a suicide mission, you know?
Yeah.
He can't. Even somebody who's, like, last thoughts, the belief he carries into the desert is that if you act according to your beliefs, if you do the best by, like, not by any rules or by a religion, but by what seems good and right inside, everything will probably be all right. That is the person that he is. And even he can't see a way out of it except I kill Varbis and die trying.
Yep.
He can't see a life past that enormous edifice of violence.
One interesting point was going to be that after Varbis dies, I think one of the phrases is, I thought it would all be over once Varbis is dead. And then it said, it takes a long time for people like Varbis to die. They leave echoes in history.
Such a good line.
It's such a good phrase. It just highlights that even though you cut off the source, there's still going to be a ripple effect. And
yeah.
Can I go back to the not being able to see a way out of the paradigm of violence that they have?
Yeah.
It reminded me again of the ones who walk away from Omelas, because the last bit of that is saying that the ones who walk away, the ones who do envision something different, or maybe they don't envision something different, but they cannot abide what's currently happening. It's talking about how nobody knows where they go. Maybe it's something completely unimaginable.
Yeah.
But they seem to know where they're going, and it's away from this.
Yeah.
And the idea that to try and imagine something better when you've lived your whole life in a way of thinking and a way of being that is awful is really hard and really scary.
Yeah.
And
it reminds me a little bit of that quote that was floating around Tumblr a little while ago saying, we've never seen a truly sane human adult.
We're all traumatized.
Because we've never lived in a world that allows that to happen. Like the systemic violence and structural oppression and the sheer weight of survival in the world that we have always lived in is such that we've never seen a healthy, sane human adult looks like. And that, it reminds me of that quite a bit.
It's kind of like the culture clash between FEB and Omnia, that when they go to each other and
That's really funny.
and they go to a Phoebe and it's, what is this? Because in Omnia there was no art. And it was like little things that you're just thinking, this is a bit, it is born out of two very different power structures.
Yeah. I enjoyed the difference between, like, philosophy isn't serious for them. So we get, in Ephebe they have philosophers. And in Om they have the Quisition, basically. But the philosophers, like, none of them believe any of the things that they're saying.
They're just saying it.
They're arguing for the sake of arguing.
Yeah,
you know,
it's
they're trying to figure out the world by having an ongoing, constant discussion. It's a process always, and sometimes they're very silly. I mean, I wanted to talk about, at least at some point, about atheism in a world where the gods demonstrably exist.
Yeah,
because that is one of the funniest ongoing jokes in Pratchett, and it's shown off very well in this book.
Yeah, it's like, Simony can have the literal god in front of him, and he'll be like, "So what?"
It'll be like good eating on a tortoise.
And what are you going to do about it? I don't believe in you. What are you going to do about it?
Yeah. The ongoing joke is the, like, in Pratchett. I think in pretty much every book there is a joke along the lines of what happens to atheists on the disc. And there's a joke about, like, Pascal's wager, and about, like, when that guy dies, he wakes up surrounded by gods going, "We'll show you what we do to Mr. Cleverdick around here." But there's a moment in this book where Brother walks into a bar full of philosophers.
Yes.
And, like, they explain that they don't believe in gods. And
so funny.
every time they do that, a god sends them, like, a very threatening sign. And then they go, except for Io, god of thunder.
Yes.
Except for Patina, goddess of wisdom, when a penguin walks past the bar, because that's a thing.
I did love that.
And then they're like, I mean, such and such a god of the ice flows of the north is garbage and not real, and we don't believe in him. And then they all wait.
And Brother goes,
for a sign.
"Did I just feel a chill in the air?"
Yeah, Brother's like, "Is it cold in here, or is it just me?" Which is just such a, like, there's a couple of moments where we see Brother's sense of humour, and it's so delightful.
It's so good.
He's just like, just poke at you. I'm just gonna poke at you. I can't resist. Yeah. I'm just gonna poke.
Not to be. No, I will be relentlessly Jewish about this. There's a joke which is about thinking about, like, atheism and atheism in a world where gods definitely exist. There's a couple of Jewish jokes that I'm thinking of, and one is there are two learned rabbis, and they're arguing up late into the night on a Friday night about whether or not God exists, and they come to the conclusion that God doesn't exist. And then one walks into synagogue the next morning and sees his friend there that he was arguing. He's like, "Didn't we agree that God doesn't exist?" And the other goes, "Oh, what does that matter?" It's kind of the opposite of looking a god in the face and going, "Well, I don't believe in you."
Yeah, or like the witches thing where they're like, they know the gods exist, but they refuse to believe in them on principle because they're all dicks.
Well, the other joke is there are 4 rabbis who are arguing, and it's always 3-1. And the one who's outnumbered in this kind, he knows he's right, and he goes, God, give me a sign, and God parts the clouds. And the other rabbis go, that could happen any time. And he goes, okay, God, give me a better sign, and lightning strikes a tree. And the other rabbis go, that could happen any time. And God himself descends from the heaven and goes, that rabbi's right, you 3 are wrong. And the rabbis all turn to each other and go, well, now it's 3 against 2. And it's just, I see that humour in Pratchett's writing.
Yeah.
And how he conceives.
And I think I mean, you were yelling in the chat about the idea of a constitutional religion, which is essentially what Brother argues for at the end. And that's very much it, is that it should be an ongoing reciprocal discussion.
That's what Torah is.
Like, yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's great. And I really enjoyed the realizing that, like, he doesn't want to be that kind of god anymore. He doesn't want to be that one that just feasts and he doesn't care about all the people that are going to die. And he, like, starts a fist fight in heaven to, like, make that work. But he basically goes, like, there's that line about, you know, if you want thousands of followers, you have to be prepared to fight for one.
Yeah, the reason that the shepherd had 100 sheep was because he was willing to go out into the wilderness to look for one that was lost. Exactly. And there's this really funny bit where all the gods show up in unison to, like, convince everyone to stop fighting, and there's this line where it's said that is, like, twisting Blind Io's hand behind his back to make him go along with it, and Blind Io in the rest of, like, the Discworld canon is one of the biggest gods around, like, with real worshippers, and he's, like, got a really massive temple in Antwerp and everything. And so it's just really funny that this god, who at the start of this was a tortoise, is strong-arming Blind Io, the god of thunder.
Yeah.
So funny.
It's an absolutely hilarious moment, and I adore it. Also, just the idea of seizing a cornucopia from another god and then smacking a sun god over the head with it, going, "Oi, sunshine!" There's so many hilarious moments in this. There's a bit where, like, an eagle is flying over the place of lamentation or whatever, and everybody's like, "Oh, it's a sign. What kind of sign is it?" And who's hiding under a statue so that the eagle can't get him, is going, "It's a bugger," is what it is.
Thinking about all the gods.
Is the funniest character in this whole book, and I will die on that hill.
Yes, very funny. Thinking about all of the gods existing, like this ensemble cast of gods, one book I would love to read in the future to do a comparative reading with this is American Gods by Neil Gaiman.
Yes.
Because obviously the two writers have a lot in common, and obviously we're going to do Good Omens at some point, which is a book that they wrote together. But a slightly different framework for lots of different gods from different origins coexisting.
And it's still like this, the mechanic is still that if you're believed in, you have power.
Yes.
And also that you can die. That gods can die when there aren't enough believers, when there isn't enough belief.
Gods having to adapt to survive.
But it's a very different...
Yeah, but one day I'd really like to read that.
Almost the gods' use to humans is not really discussed in any way, which I think, like, is kind of the point of small gods, is sort of like, what are they for then?
Yeah. Where do we as people stand in relation to our gods? And what do we owe them and what do they owe us? Yeah. We're thinking of other books. Are you guys reading anything else at the moment that you want to talk about? That's a no?
I did, and then they, like, instantly fell out of my brain. Oh, I know, I started reading This Is How You Lose the Time War.
Oh, my mother-in-law loves that book. Yes. It's so good. It's blowing my entire mind. It's so beautiful. It reminds me a lot of looking at sort of fantastical art like that of Tilly Walden or Sean Tan, where you kind of suddenly go, oh shit, that's what you can do with art. You know, you can create these whole fantastical landscapes where, like, fish swim in air and there's a giant deer walking through the streets of the city, and, you know, there's kind of like, it's art. We don't need to obey the laws of physics. We don't need to obey the laws of the natural world. Let's really do something special and beautiful. And it feels like it's very much leaning into we can make any world we want. So let's do something really beautiful and compelling and interesting. And it's just, there's lots of them all piled up together. And I really like that. And the mechanism by which so it's basically there is a time war going on, shockingly. And there are two agents on opposite sides who are trying to thwart each other. And at the scene of each of their sort of operations, they start leaving each other these letters. The letters that can only work if you travel in time, basically. There's, like, burn after reading, and one of the letters is like,
in the tree rings of a tree that gets felled by the Mongol horde that one of them is carefully nurturing in order to win this one particular skirmish. And it's somebody having just so much fun with the infinite possibility of sci-fi and fantasy universes. Somebody who's like, you know what, I'm gonna find every single beautiful thing I can do with this concept and give it to you. And I'm really enjoying that. Also, lesbians.
Makes any book better.
Just in case that wasn't convincing you all, and I know I was kind of rambling a bit.
No, it's good. That's what this podcast is for. I've just been rereading a bunch of fanfic because my brain is currently like a giant mash of like overcooked pasta at the moment. So
I was going to recommend a fanfic for Small Gods. Actually, ooh. I'm digging it out of my bookmarks now, but it's basically sort of about and brother between the last scene where we see them, where they make the agreement, and when brother dies.
Yeah, because you get this lovely little epilogue at the end of brother's life.
But yeah, what's it called? It's something like We Must Tend Our Garden or something, which was the other Mad Max thing I was thinking, is that they go away to find the green place and then they have to build it where they were.
Oh, can I just say, we didn't talk about this. Brother dies 100 years after he goes through the desert. And he dies, and he's in the desert of black sand after you die. And Varbis is still there. Varbis hasn't started walking.
Yes.
And Varbis died 100 years ago. And brother picks him up and starts walking with him across the desert again. And it's so powerful. I love it. But yeah, anyway, sorry, you're talking about this this fanfic that's in between, before that.
And it's about, it's kind of the one God, one believer sort of trope again. And it's just really beautiful, and I can't explain it, and I also can't find the bookmark.
Link to it on the Tumblr,
Look out for that on the Tumblr at some point. I will link it, but I think it's the only Small Gods fanfic I've ever read, and it just fits so beautifully with it that I want everybody to read it. It's delightful.
Amazing. Anything you've been reading, Lottie?
Okay, so I guess I've been rereading. I've started rereading Way of Kings, which I probably said in a previous episode that I was rereading it, but I've actually sat down and started reading it again.
Is that the first book in the Mistborn series?
No, the first book in Stormlight. It is Brandon Sanderson though, and right. I love it, and it gives me because the next book comes out. Well, I guess.
Yes, you mentioned
soonish. So when we're recording this, just timestamp it, and I've got 3 1,000-page books to read prior to that because I just love it because it's such a good series. In the sense of, like, I would love to do it on this podcast, but it's 1,000 pages long. Like, it's a bit of a brute. Like, you could probably do half of it.
Yeah. And Small Gods is very short, and I feel like we could probably talk for another 2 whole episodes about this.
Absolutely could. We absolutely could.
It's such a good series, but I just love Brandon Sanderson's writing style and his just humour with the characters, and the fact that all these characters are different, and you sort of find out their backstories as you read through the book, which you think, it's this one thing, and then it's actually something else. But like one of my favourite quotes, which I took a screenshot of it because it made me so happy, was this guy is effectively, he's a slave, and he's just getting very annoyed with the guy who is the slave owner, and basically just says, okay, what do you want me to do? And he says, first find a cliff, and then he says, yes, because I want to throw you off the cliff because you're annoying me. I just love the humour. Anyway, I'm going to stop rambling.
Well, we have got actually 2 cat reviews to give this week because some friends of the podcast have a small independent bookshop.
Yay!
Which has a cat and whose name is Thomas, and we would like to make sure that Thomas gets a chance to weigh in with his opinions on books. He lives with Colne Valley Books, which is a second-hand bookshop in Slaithwaite near Huddersfield. They have fiction, non-fiction, and antiquarian books, and we will link their website below. Thomas's review criteria will be: are there soft things to snap on? Are there cables to chew? And are there cons or theft? I think there's.
He's not going to like this book.
Well, there's some sneaking around, but it is. I mean, it largely takes place in a desert, which is kind of. I mean, cats.
And there's lots of bones. There's lots of bones to chew on in the desert.
Yeah. I think perhaps
but not cables.
I think perhaps we could find a better book for Thomas to review. I don't know exactly. I don't want to put words in his mouth, because unlike the cat that actually lives in our house, so I can say whatever about her. I don't know. What do you guys think Thomas would give this? I'd go for maybe a 4.
Yeah, there's lots of warm rocks to nap on. I think that is important for cats.
There is that, but there is very few cables. And there is.
I'm going with, like, I think Eli's right. I think like a 4 for Thomas.
I think Gothmog might rate it slightly higher because of the implication that she would be a small god by the terms of this book because we worship her.
I think that's very true.
She is a cute bean. It must be said.
It says 6.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Obviously, from a human perspective, I'm going with, like, it's about 2,100 and what's it out of 10.
It's one of my favourite books of all time, and I would recommend it to anyone.
Yeah, basically.
I definitely recommend this book if you haven't read any Discworld before, coming from someone who hasn't read them before. Just go and read it, and then listen back to the episode again. You'll probably understand a heck of a lot more what everyone was talking about.
Yeah, that was.
I love Discworld.
It's going to be a bit chaotic.
It will make you a better person for having read it, honestly. And I don't say that about a lot of things. But yeah, so that was this week's episode. Next week, we will be reading and reviewing Murder on the Orient Express. Which is, I'm very excited about that.
Very excited.
A little bit of
Yeah,
murder mystery.
Agatha Christie.
Absolutely.
Thank you all so much for listening. Please like, subscribe, review if you want to. Add us on all the socials. You can go to our website, which is linked on, below. And send us a message. And thank you all for listening.
Bye.